What do we have online? Honor. Okay. There we go. All right. So we're gonna get started. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. We are gonna get our quarterly commission meeting started. Appreciate everyone's time. We're gonna start off by recognizing the members in attendance. We have myself, Judge Marsico, Secretary Harry, Chairman Fox, Professor Mystic, DA Bible, Defense Attorney Volkovic, right? Volkovic. And then online, I see we're joined by Judge Daly, Judge McDermott, Professor Rago, Rep Bonner, and I believe that is everyone, correct? Okay, well, sorry. Oh, yes. First, we need to approve the meeting minutes. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
All right, moved by Judge Marsico. Okay, seconded by Dale Bakovic. Thank you.
Chair, if we just go back one more thing
Nope.
real quick and see if there's any public
Oh,
comment.
my apologies.
No, it's okay.
Little rusty.
That's-
Sorry.
That's why we have this slide to remind
That's
all
why
of
you have
us.
the slide that's literally in front of me.
It's for all
I
of
could
our
be
sake,
I
yeah.
could be looking at. Is there anyone online who is waiting for public comment? All right, seeing none. We'll now go back and forward in time in the agenda. And I will pass it to Executive Director Wyman.
So the motion was.
Oh, all those in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Motion's moved. Motion is approved. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. I'd like to start by giving an opportunity for our ex officio members to provide an update, and I'll start with Secretary Harry.
Thank you. Good morning. Just one quick update. Excuse me. We did kick off a veteran initiative on our parole field services side. So obviously this ties in with Senate Resolution 196. And so we're looking forward to whatever comes of that. But because of some of the themes that occurred and just as you were looking at it, so we've been intentional about how we are kicking off this initiative to ensure a good, smooth continuity of care from the institutional side into the field services side. And that's all I had.
Great. Thank you. And we'll hear a little later about our progress on Senate Resolution 196 and our work in that area, as well as our updated evaluation of short sentence parole and our work with the DOC on that. Chairman Fox.
I don't have any thing of great significance. I did attend a conference in Atlanta, Georgia for the Association of International Paroling Authorities. And I will say this, as I left that meeting, I am very happy to work and live in Pennsylvania and work with our Sentencing Commission, work with our court system and our Department of Corrections. I think we have a lot of things going for us. So a lot of my colleagues have a difficult way to go based on what they're seeing. So anyway, I think sometimes we don't think about how that goes with the rest of the country. I think we're in a really good position. So that was my takeaway coming back to my comment.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Fox. Moving on now to commission staff. This month, a member of our team, Sue Schaefer, who started in July of 2014, has retired from the commission. Sue worked here in Harrisburg at our Harrisburg office as our administrative assistant and was instrumental in setting up many of the activities of these commission meetings, worked closely with Ryan on the Villanova workshop and all the logistics associated with that, assisted us greatly in our annual report, and then a number of other duties. But beyond her administrative work, she was a wonderful human being, and she's still around, of course, but we'll miss her greatly and miss her camaraderie and friendship. So happy trails to our colleague, Sue Schaefer. I also want to draw your attention on page 13 of your notebook, which is our organizational chart. We had another staff person in the Applications and Information Technology unit leave the commission for a different job. And working with the unit managers and the deputy directors, it was determined that for budgetary reasons that we're going to leave these vacancies open right now. So we have a vacancy in the Application and Information Technology unit. We have a vacancy now in the administrative unit, and we also have a vacancy in the Education and Outreach unit. So something just to note for later when we go through the budget and operations. At the beginning of this fiscal year, we started with 24 FTE on our org chart. We reduced that to 22 based on just the need. One was a position for communication and another for some outreach activities. But right now we're operating with 19 FTE out of the 22. And so our goal, of course, is to fill those vacant positions. But again, given the budgetary uncertainty, we'll move forward as is and absorbing the extra work with the staff we have. And later we'll hear a little bit about on the applications and information technology side of using some consultants to fill in some of that work from our funds that we receive from JRI. All right, moving to the next item of commission operations. Just a reminder that we have reappointments for the commission upcoming, that everyone on the commission, all members' terms end September 30th of 2025. So next week or in the next couple of weeks, I'll be sending out letters to the appointment authorities with attendance of members at these meetings over the last 2 years, as well as a request to fill those open appointments. That process started this week, actually, with a visit with AOPC, met with the state court administrator, mainly to talk about the Veterans Project, and I'll talk more about that later. But that was an opportunity to remind court administration of our 4 judicial appointments and the need to reappoint or find new members for us starting, again, September 30th, 2025. So I'm hoping that all members will consider continuation on the commission. I think we have certainly newer members as well as some longer-standing members, and we have a great body to work with. But again, more information forthcoming in the next few weeks regarding that process. Also want to point out that I've been working with the university about renewing the lease of our office at Penn State University, our offsite location at Calder Way. We have a 5-year lease, which weirdly doesn't correspond to our MOU with Penn State, but our current lease is expiring in August. So I'm hoping it's pro forma that we just renew the office there. This is through the MOU, which is that the Penn State University will provide the commission with office space. So we don't pay the lease for that. We simply pay for that through our the monies that we provide through the MOU to Penn State directly. So Penn State pays the leasing agent. I believe it's being reviewed this week by the staff attorneys at Penn State University to approve that. I'm hoping that this runs smoothly and there's no issues. I'll certainly let the commission know if there are any challenges or problems that come up in the next couple of weeks regarding that renewal. But we have a really nice space, of course, and would like to thank previous commission members and maybe current members for helping us negotiate with Penn State to find an office that was suitable. And part of that was the ability to host the meetings in our office. Previously, they were hosted off-site in hotels. We have a very nice conference room that allows for these types of meetings to occur at our property in State College. So just wanted to bring that up as an important extension. And later we'll talk about, of course, the September meeting in State College at the end of the meeting, but that business meeting will be held at our property, at our office at Calder Way. So more to come on that conversation. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the fiscal items and turn your attention to pages 14, 15, and 16 in your notebook. This reflects the operating budget as of 5/28/2025. So it's not the full fiscal year of expenditures and monies used, But a couple things to note, just starting on page, let's see, what page is this? 15 of your notebook. As a reminder, we had our original budget, our operating budget was approved of roughly 4.08 million. With the reductions of the 2 FTE staff that I just mentioned, we had a modified budget of 3.7 million as our full operating budget. We've taken a number of cost-saving measures because of our appropriation being flat funded since 2019, 2020 of 2.55 million. So obviously, 3.7 of operating expenses doesn't get you very far with 2.5. So if you focus on the far right column, and I won't spend a ton of time on this, this is back on page 14, you'll see the remaining budget for salaries that we saved about 120,000 through the vacancies that we have. Other cost cutting measures have focused on reduction of travel. I think one of the areas of small savings has even been in the changing of the format of this meeting by starting at 11 o'clock. Some members are able to travel here without having overnight stays. So we really tried to tighten our belt on a number of areas, including limiting the replacement of equipment and computers, software. Ryan and I reviewed the publications we received and have reduced that almost in half to just the core essentials. So as we've talked about in a number of these meetings, there's not a tremendous amount on the operating side that we can tighten our belt on. Most of our salary or our expenses are on the salaries themselves. And then not a lot of discretionary expenses above and beyond that. But we've tried our best. The last line I'll just note is we build in use of consultants not related to the building of Caser, our web-based application. This fiscal year, we didn't rely on any consultant work. So we're just trying to be as streamlined as possible. And expenditures for the year were roughly $3.3 million, $3.4 million, hard to tell with outstanding billing, of course. And then I'll just note that the one other item here is on the line for SGS Next Gen. We spent about $275,000 on the work of rebuilding SGS Web for Caser. If you remembered, and we'll come to this shortly again, we've kind of encumbered the JRI funds for that project. Several meetings ago, we severed our relationship with a consultant that we had a $900,000 contract with. So those funds would have been designated for that work with that external consultant. We're utilizing those additional funds for work with targeted consultants now in small contracts to supplement our staff. So we'll come to that in a moment as an action item shortly in regards to extending that contract with those consultants. But I sort of view that part of the budget as, again, encumbered for the use for our computer operating. So the next item, if we turn the page, I'm sorry, and I'm looking now on page 16, this is our remaining treasury balances. And it's difficult to interpret all of this, and it's maybe on paper, it looks like we have a lot of money in the bank. But one thing to focus on is that the JRI monies that I mentioned, we're viewing as encumbered, designated to the work for Caser. And you could see in parentheses, it's showing that we have a shortfall of 350,000 this fiscal year that we're going to be utilizing other reserve funds for. But what's not reflected here is that we had other reserve funds in another account that we drew down to zero. So this year, our shortfall was about $700,000 to cover, and it will be reflected in a reduction of the reserve account, which is the top, which was designated to the commission in about 2015 and 16 for a budgetary impasse, but we drained the other surpluses we had to zero. And a lot of that money came from the MOU we have with Penn State. So we have a 5-year MOU with Penn State of $225,000 a year. At the end of the MOU, monies that are not spent through that agreement become the commission's money to use. We use that in this case to offset some of our shortfall. So again, at first blush, it may look like we have lots of money to keep operations going. But if next year we have a $700,000 shortfall, we really only have about 350,000 left in our reserves. We're going to have a challenge there related to that. So before I move on to fiscal year 25-26 operating budget, just want to open it up if there are any questions. I know there's a lot of numbers there and some math.
Do any commission members, either in person or online, have any questions?
Okay. Also, just want to let the chair know that Senator Street is now online.
Okay, welcome, Senator Street. And yeah, thank you to Matt and the staff for your creative accounting.
Okay, so now we'll move on to, in the notebook, it is our second action item of the day, which is our draft of our proposed operating budget for 25-26. So typically at the June meeting, the commission approves the operating budget for the next fiscal year. Built into this model, again, even with the budget uncertainties, this is just what we think the expenses will be, not of course what we'll actually utilize if we don't receive the funds, is a 3% increase in staff salary, which has been consistent with the policies of Penn State University, who provides our HR support. So you'll see a slight increase in staff salaries there. And then I'll just note a couple things, and they're really tiny, but Commission through Penn State recently moved away from having physical phones. We now utilize Teams, which is a web-based application. So our phones actually ring on our computers. But a couple of staff do still continue to have cell phones, Bobby and Ryan. I have a physical phone, and we have a conference line in both our office here in Harrisburg and in State College. So there's a slight reduction there, a tiny bit. As I noted, we're reducing the publications and the journal expenditures. We've reduced the line for consulting, but essentially the budget here is very similar to the operating budget of the past. So I asked the chair, let me find the right language. Hang on one moment. For approval of actions related to the fiscal year 25-26 operating budget.
All right. Thank you. Before we move into the action, do any members have any questions about the proposed budget?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yep. Is
Very
that Judge Daly?
Yes.
right,
So,
here we go.
Matt, I by looking at these numbers, I would think, I guess these numbers reflect a full complement of employees.
That is correct. This is the full allotment of 22 FTEs. And I should note one other item, and I apologize for not highlighting this. This operating budget of 3.8 million, if you remember, we made a request for an operating budget of 3.4 million to the legislature because it includes the 400,000 for the SGS Next Gen. And as I've noted, we have encumbered funds through the JRI money. So I effectively subtract that from the operating budget, even though it's part of the operating budget, but our request, which is slightly different, was 3.4 million.
And I guess if this budget request isn't met, then we're going to be out of reserves at the end of this fiscal year or close to it.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
There are other alternatives that we can talk to the commission about. Of course, this earmarked money for the revision of SGS Web, even though it's encumbered for that, we certainly could use it for operating expenses. The implications would be that the development of that tool, which is, utilized by judges and DAs and defense and probation and others, would be really delayed because we would be unable to utilize that money for the consultant work who's supplementing our current staff. And we'll hear more about that later, about the progress on that. But so there may be funds to keep the lights on, but there'll be significant implications in terms of our effectiveness of the services we can provide and deliver.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Before we move into the motion, I do want to take a moment to thank the vice chair and the legislative members as well, Rep. Bonner and Senator Street. We definitely take this shortfall very seriously and have all been hitting the pavement trying to utilize all of our legislative relationships and make it clear to the legislature that this increased investment in the commission is necessary. I know Representative Bonner, submitted a letter of support on behalf of the commission. We had some good meetings this week in Harrisburg, myself and Matt with Senator Street, and also the Appropriations Chairman of the House, Jordan Harris. So we're definitely doing what we can to get this money in the budget this year, and this month. Obviously, folks know the federal situation is uncertain to say the least. But we don't want that to distract from the important work of the commission. And so we're working really hard to make sure that we get the funds necessary to meet the needs of this budget. So thank you to everyone for your work on this. And with that, do we have a motion to approve the proposed operating budget? All right. Motion made by DA Bible. Do I have a second?
I'll second it. Judge Bailey.
Seconded by, thank you. Seconded by Judge Daly. All those in favor? All opposed? All right, motion passes. Thank you.
Great. And I also want to echo the chair's sentiments about the thanks to both the chair, the vice chair, also Professor Mystic, our other members. Obviously, we've talked about this a lot as a group, and some of us have talked about it as well, about strategies to move forward. And I really appreciate all the efforts of the members, our legislative members, understanding the implications, as I noted, about what will happen if we're receiving flat funding again, the delays, the implication in terms of our service delivery. Clearly, we have new guidelines, 8th edition guidelines. Ryan and Bobby and his team, the ability to communicate and train and provide materials to individuals, the ability for our staff to provide legislative impact analyses on a timely way. We take great pride in, we receive a request from staff from House Appropriations or Senate Appropriations, Judiciary. We turn that around in 24 hours. And the only way we can do that is because we have the staff to be able to do that and devote that, not counting even the extra projects we receive from the legislature, be it SR 196 or HR 111, which take a commitment. I've been thinking a lot about the project, the Senate Resolution 196. We probably devote 2 to 2.5 FT every day to that project for 15 months. So we have 19 staff who have a lot of other duties and activities. And because of the Senate resolution, we divert a lot of attention and focus. A very important study, and we're glad to be asked to do it. We're glad to be able to do it. But without the funding in the future, we will be challenged to devote additional resources and times to those types of huge lifts in the future. Okay. The next item is a couple other service purchase contracts that the commission would like to have, or staff would ask the commission to consider. The first is through our relationship with Penn State. As you know, they handle all of our HR activities and our payroll. So this is essentially entering into a contract with Penn State, as we're considered a grant through Penn State, so that we can be invoiced and then pay them through this grant for our salaries. It includes a few other additional items like travel, fleet car services, and et cetera. So it's not committing us to anything other than it's the functional way that we are able to get paid as staff through Penn State and be treated as, like I said, a grant project where they invoice us every month for the staff's salaries. So ask the chair to seek a motion for the approval of a service purchase contract for fiscal year 25-26 with the Pennsylvania State University for commission operating expenses in the amount of $2,926,211.
All right. Do we have a motion to approve the contract?
I'll do it, Judge McDermott.
All right. Motion made by Judge McDermott. Can I have a second?
Second, Professor Rego.
Seconded by Professor Rego. All those in favor? All
Aye.
opposed? All opposed? All right, the motion passes.
Great, thank you. And I'll note for the record in the next action item that our counsel, Professor Mystic, has left the room, and we now are going to be talking about the extension of his contract as legal counsel. As most of you know, Professor Mystic has been with the commission for 25 or more years, working closely with the executive director and the commission on a number of matters. He's an invaluable resource for the team as it relates to policy matters, legal matters, procedural matters, etc. So seeking approval of a service purchase contract for fiscal year 25-26 with Professor Joseph Sabino Mystic for legal counsel services in the amount of $50,000.
Do you have a motion?
Move.
Moved by Judge Marsico. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
All right, seconded by Attorney Bakovic. All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? All right, the motion passes. Oh, I believe Senator Street online wanted to make a comment. Oh. All right. Well, if Senator Street does want to make a comment, he can feel free to go off mute. But otherwise, we'll move ahead.
Okay, the next action item relates to our contracting services with a firm called Carbon Creek. For the last several quarters, Carbon Creek has been working with us. We have had one programmer working as a consultant to support the development of the Commission on Sentencing's Record Exchange, our web-based application to replace SGS Web. As I mentioned earlier, we're utilizing these targeted consulting opportunities to supplement our current allotment of current staff at the commission. This is in lieu of the contract we had with the other group that I mentioned earlier that we canceled. So we've been doing very targeted small contracts with one individual. And now, because of the vacancy in that unit and for progress related to that project, we're actually going to hopefully engage with two individuals. So the previous service purchase contracts have been not to exceed $50,000, and they've been in the range of about $35,000 a quarter is what we've been paying for the one consultant. So, but we could theoretically be up to $50,000. So, seeking a motion for the approval of a service purchase contract for fiscal year 25-26 with Carbon Creek, not to exceed $100,000 to provide application development services for the next gen CASER application.
All right. We've been rejoined by Professor Mystic. Congratulations. Do we have a motion to move forward with the service purchase contract? All right, motion made by DA Bible. Do we have a second?
Second,
Judge McDermott.
All right. I think Judge Marsico beat to the punch. So seconded by Judge Marsico. All those in favor?
Aye.
All
Aye.
opposed? All opposed, none. All right. Motion passes. Thank you.
Okay, well, that wraps up our executive update. So I will now turn it over to the Senior Deputy Director, Ryan Myers, to walk us through administration and outreach update.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning. I'm going to ask Bobby to join me as he will be providing some education and outreach updates momentarily. What you will see here on the screen are the three topics that I wish to discuss with you here this morning. A brief summary of the commission staff's efforts around annual reporting of sentencing and verification of those sentences. I'll talk and provide an update on the commission's annual reports, both 2023 and 2024, and then briefly talk about upcoming educational partnerships through our various MOUs with Penn State University, as well as, and I see a typo up here, it should say Duquesne Law School. So we do have one with Villanova, but I want to update us on fall 2025 with Duquesne Law School. So This is a slide that I shared with members back in March, and I just wanted to use it a bit as a reminder and not to go through all of the detail here. Each year, staff engage in what we refer to as the reporting and verification effort with counties in terms of sentences that need to be reported to the commission, as well as resentences. However, our focus in recent years has been on the sentencing side, and we'll talk a little bit more, and Bobby will provide you some updates on a focus that we have this year on resentencing. But I just wanted to provide this as a reminder that we begin this process in January, and it's a combination of efforts, multiple units within the commission, as well as collaborating with AOPC for data that's relevant and important to our verification process. As you can see, I've placed some nice check boxes next to the months and the fact that we completed what we had talked to you about in March, and now we're in June. And so what we have done in recent years, over the past 4 years, I believe, is during the June meeting, at least that's our target time frame, to provide you information on percentages for reporting of sentences, both statewide and by county. And so on page 25 of your commission notebook, you will see a table listing each county and their percent reporting for sentences for the year. And so I thought I'd just share with you some high-level numbers of the effort, and really Bobby and the Education Outreach Unit deserve the credit here in terms of they work with each one of our counties to make sure we're getting all the sentences that we should be receiving and assisting them with any technical issues. But for 2024, we saw statewide 98% of cases were reported to the commission. And so we feel pretty good about that. Of course, we'd love to see 100, but we know cases, come through the system and some are unique and need a little extra assistance. But just as a reference, that's a 2% increase from last year. Bobby's unit continues to make headway on reporting of sentences from the counties. As a little bit of background, just really briefly, in 2020, the commission voted on an initial proposed sort of certification process and setting a threshold of 85% for counties to meet what we would say is compliance with reporting of sentences. As you can see, for 2024 sentencing, 62 counties are at 95% or higher, and so clearly above the 85% threshold. Of those 62 counties, 49 of them are at 98% or higher, and so that's a really high percentage for counties across the state. And the last thing I want to mention here is the final bullet to say, for the first time in the years that we've been doing the percentages, we now have 0 counties that are below the threshold, which is great, and all of the counties are 90% or higher, and so that's really good. And so again, the testament to Bobby and the folks in the Education and Outreach Unit. What I will do, and just to make commission members aware, and this is consistent with previous year practices, we want to present this information to you. We provide it in the notebook. We will post this on the commission's website as we have in previous years, and practitioners and counties can go to the commission's website and see their reported percentages since 2019, I believe now, and we'll make this available most likely tomorrow or early next week on the commission's website. Any questions regarding annual reporting?
I have a question.
Yes, Judge.
So is there any follow-up on these counties? Like I'm looking at Northampton County. So I'd like to know who those 34 cases belong to. So do we follow up with the President Judge or whatever?
Yeah, we can absolutely follow up with you, Judge.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And provide you the specific information of those outstanding cases.
Okay. Because I mean, they could be mine, they could be somebody else's, but at least then we can nudge people along.
Yes, we can do that. We'll make a note of it. And I appreciate the question. One of the things that we also do after the commission meeting is communicate to counties that this information is available via correspondence to the court so that they have the document and they know that they can find it on the commission's website. But we always want to present the information to members first before we release it statewide and publicly. Judge?
Philadelphia had been an issue. I'm glad to see they've complied, but I guess their total number of 6,000 to me seems low relative to other numbers. Is that, I know that's total on SGS Web.
all cases, could there be ways the cases are not in SGS Web from start to finish?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And Philadelphia, first, correct. Philadelphia has done a lot of work in the recent years to come over the threshold in reporting 85% or higher, and frankly, do a really good job in their percentage. I think the context that we need to provide around Philadelphia that you don't see here and you don't necessarily see in the annual report is just the unique nature in which their magisterial or the municipal, whatever the label of the Philadelphia Municipal Court can hear up to misdemeanor 1 offenses. And just as a reminder, so think about all of the misdemeanor 1 offenses in the system that are probably coming through Philadelphia. The commission's guidelines do not require reporting of sentences that are not in a court of record. And so we may receive some of those cases, if they end up in front of the judges, the common pleas, but by and large, that's a large number of cases. So you think about like DUIs would be a bulk of those cases, and then other misdemeanor cases that we don't see. Yeah. So
yeah,
that-
and if I can interrupt, yeah,
Yes, Judge.
we've had a decrease in numbers too, obviously, in terms of the arrest. And in theory, there's more diversionary programs, but those are pretty accurate.
So municipal court judges don't use the guidelines when they sentence?
So I'll talk to what the guidelines say, and I would have to defer to the judge in Philadelphia to provide more context to it. But what the guidelines say is courts should consider the guidelines for any misdemeanor or felony offense, and so it's not saying anything about whether that's a court of record or not, but courts should consider it. On the reporting end of sentences, the guidelines are pretty clear that courts of record are required to report to us. So in my conversations, and I've had a lot of conversations with both common pleas and municipal court in Philadelphia over the years in promoting consideration, obviously at the common pleas they do, but at the municipal level, consideration of the guidelines at sentencing, but we aren't requiring them to report. Yeah. Sure. Like ARD cases, or the commission does not collect information on ARDs or probation without verdicts and so forth. So we do not collect anything on summaries. Yeah. So if you think about just the context of the guidelines and the framework, the commission makes recommendations around misdemeanor and felony offenses. And so that's what we're looking at when we're collecting information. This is about an OTN level of cases coming through. Yeah. Correct. And sentence. Yep. Yep.
One quick question is for the discrepancy in cases that are not reported, are you seeing any trends or usual patterns for why that is, whether it's clerical errors or just user error, whatever?
Yeah, I think Bobby can always correct me. He's a bit closer to it now than I am. I'm trying to think of how best to say this. There are sentences in our court systems, and I'll phrase it as that might be inconsistent with statute. All right. And staff program SGS Web to be consistent with statute. And so if you have that inconsistency, they might not be able to enter it into our system. So that would be one example, right? For instance, if somebody received a 6-year sentence for a misdemeanor 1 offense, misdemeanor 1's 5-year maximum, right? And so they would not be able to enter that. That might be one example. Another one is the commission has now for a number of years required that the courts have a state identification number or an SID to submit information in SGS Web. And I think this is probably more of the number that would be more of a contributor to that number. Because we require that, sometimes counties don't have an SID for an individual, and that bars them from entering it into SGS Web. Now, we have over time with counties assisted in submitting cases that are absent an SID number, in particular when, for instance, you have a defendant who's charged, been through the process, pleas, is sentenced, they don't fingerprint them. That's how you get the SID, right? So they don't fingerprint them and they subsequently die, right? Obviously, we're not going to get the fingerprints there. And so if counties are reaching out to us and a person's deceased, we assist there. Another one, if you can think about it, I'm just giving some examples, we have 80 running across our Commonwealth, and we have people that are transient in terms of they're stopped on 80 on their way back to wherever in the Midwest. And courts may act quickly to handle that case and send them on their way. And they may fall through the cracks in terms of the fingerprint. And now they're, out in Iowa and they're never coming back. And so you see sort of some of those things, or where our counties are on the outside of the state and connected to other states, and people are sort of living in New York and not coming back to Pennsylvania. There become some administrative matters there. So I think, it's really the SID, but we try to help counties identify those cases early. And if they are residents of the county, really promoting that they get those individuals fingerprinted. Right. So I think those are the best two examples I can give you, Chair.
Got it. Understood. And
Yeah.
echoing, thank you for the work and getting these numbers to such a high margin.
Any other questions? All right, keep moving. I'm going to talk about our 2023 annual report and 2024 annual report as an update. This will just be a placeholder slide for you. Staff have finalized the 23 annual report. And what we will do just from a process standpoint is either tomorrow or on Monday next week, we will provide all commission members via email the report with our anticipated posting to the commission's website next week, I believe on Wednesday. All right. And I'll just provide a little detail and historical context. Over the last several years, the staff have been catching up on annual reports. Part of that was due to COVID, and then also doing a COVID edition of the annual report so that we could look at 2020 and 2021. And then other projects, as Matt talked about, sort of taking our staff's time. Also during this time frame, we have brought the production of the report, visual production and formatting in-house, in which we had assistance from the Senate print shop in the past. But we tried to take that on for ourselves to streamline the process a little bit. And so we've been working through sort of all of those moving parts. But I'm happy to say that we've finalized the 2023. We will provide that to members most likely tomorrow via email. And then we'll post next week on the commission's website, making that public for practitioners. And I think that's about what I need to say about the 2023, but you can see here, it looks quite nice. We will work with the Senate print shop to have a limited number of copies made. And just as we think about budget and other things at no cost to the commission. So we'll make those available to commission members as well. And we'll reserve some physical copies in both the Harrisburg and the State College office for any visitors that we may have. But we've moved much more to a digital format in recent years. So I'll pause for a second to give it to the executive director.
So just two things to note. I want to, on the record, do want to thank the Senate print shop. We have an amazing resource there who designs our cover for us. And as Ryan said, it is quite impressive. And thankfully, we don't have to work with a consultant on anything like that. And it's free and fast, and she does a remarkable job. And then I think the second piece, that the posting of the annual report on the website triggers the availability of the data from 2023. So we'll hear later in the research update about requests for data sets. So this really is the way, as we've been delayed, most recently, we've been posting our data tables online in advance of the publication to make sure that people have access to our data because of our delays in production. But this year, we're kind of on time-ish. And so this will now allow individuals to request the 2023 sentencing data.
Perfect. Thank you, Matt. Here's I added that this morning. So we have the new cover for our 2024 annual report that was provided to us from Amy at the Senate print shop. And so this is, again, is just a visual placeholder to say that we're actively working on the content for the annual report. As I mentioned, we are now done with the 2024 sentencing and reporting process. And so that's vital to the research and data analysis unit that create the data tables that are part of the report, and also allows us to review it for the text of the report. One thing I'll mention, and Matt can add to this or correct me if I misstate it, the 2024 report will be the first year in which we have a representation of 2 editions of guidelines. right, in a number of years. So we'll have 7th edition cases that will have a bulk of the sentences reported in that given year. And then, of course, we'll have those early 8th edition cases. And so we have to wrestle through how do we present that information. And Matt will talk a little bit more about 8th edition sentences that we've received and can speak to that. But I think what we talked about prior to the meeting is, as Matt mentioned, we'll be in State College in September. And so there might be some opportunities to talk to commission members at the September meeting on what we're seeing with 2024 data in regards to 8th edition, and present a way in which we can show that information in the annual report that's consumable, but does not give the incorrect picture of the information that we have at the time for this report. So, stay tuned. We'll work through the summer to have more information available to you during the September meeting. But as Matt mentioned, we're on time-ish, I think was his phrase. Typically, if we're moving along in the way we had prior to COVID, we generally targeted the end of a calendar year by the December meeting to have an annual report ready for release. It just takes the time to get through it all for a year. So we're back on that timetable with the 2024. All right. Before I talk about the educational partnerships, and here you can see I have fixed my typo earlier and we're back to the Duquesne Law School. I'm remiss, I did not mention regarding the sentencing reporting, and Bobby will talk more about it, but one of the areas in which we know we have had a limited amount of information in terms of data is around reporting of resentences. And so I'll let Bobby talk about the effort that he's currently undertaken, but we have identified this year, 2025, to work directly with the county court systems, and in particular, talking with county probation departments about processes for reporting of resentences. We have some counties we know that do it well. We have some counties we know that aren't doing it at all. And then we have everything in between. And it's really an outreach effort to say, here's information we have. What kind of information do you have? How can we be of assistance so that we can move towards creating a resentencing percentages in the future? And I think that will be really helpful. But hopefully I didn't say more than what Bobby wanted me to say. And I'll stop talking about that and talk a little bit about educational partnerships for you. Just as a reminder, we have an MOU with Penn State University in terms of teaching, right? And as part of that MOU is staff at the commission teach one sentencing or criminology related course. Of course, it's in sentencing. That makes a lot of sense. And we do that each fall and spring. After the March meeting, staff completed the spring semester. It was successful, and we will be back on the listing for fall 2025 and teaching sentencing to undergraduates at Penn State University. And starting in the fall, again, through our MOU with Duquesne Law School, staff will be at the law school teaching a course in correction, sanctions, and sentencing for law school students that are second or third year law school students. It's much more of like a seminar course in which they're provided the rules of the road and then asked to sentence real cases and discuss those cases. And I think it's a valuable relationship for the commission and Duquesne Law School and the students that are coming through. I think that it's also a unique course in terms of law schools that provide specific coursework on sentencing related matters. And so we appreciate the opportunity to be at Duquesne Law School in the fall each year. So with that being said, if there's not any questions for me, I'll turn it to Bobby to provide his education outreach update.
Good morning, still, barely. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to probably talk maybe a little bit out of sequence just to kind of piggyback on what Ryan was mentioning related to the resentencing. I'll give you an update on that project. So at the end of last month, May, I sent a message to the chief probation officer of H County here in Pennsylvania, just sharing the information that we have reported through SGS Web related to resentencing of probation. Through this morning, I've had a conversation with a representative from each county in 34 of our 67 counties. So I think that's really good number and really early on in this effort. So working with those counties, first, as Ryan said, to just understand the data. As Ryan said, there's a difference in the level of reporting across Pennsylvania, which is to be expected. So just trying to understand what numbers should we be seeing, What are any sort of barriers or deficiencies? What can we do to help them and work through that process? So I'm really viewing this year as our first effort. So thinking back to where we started with the reporting of sentencing, I think it'll be a little bit of a process getting counties up on the resentencing side, but based on the initial reach out from counties, I'm optimistic that maybe we'll have a quicker turnaround now that we have a good workflow in how we work with the counties for the reporting of sentencing information. So I'll keep you all updated as I progress through the project on that. In terms of technical assistance, we've had 67 roll requests and 522 inquiries so far through May of this year. In addition to that, we've responded to 26 inmate requests and 2 right to knows. Our educational programming, just kind of give you an update on that. We have modified the course offerings that we have for 2025. I mentioned that at our March meeting, but since the March meeting, we are also incorporating 2 new courses that we're going to start this summer. One is related to offense gravity scores, and the other is focusing on enhancements. So those will start July and alternate 1 per month. So looking forward to offering that. As Ryan mentioned, and as I'm sure Matt's going to cover in a little bit, we're seeing a lot more 8th edition cases flowing through the system, and this is an element of the 8th edition that I think people are now starting to pay attention to as they're starting to see more cases beyond the prior record score side of things, which people have continued to have a lot of interest in. There's now a relevant time for people to, I guess, focus on that. So we're trying to meet those needs. So with that, we have, I think, 8 total different courses that we're offering each month. One of those is we do twice a year, Commission News, July and November, where we just kind of give a snapshot in time of different things, case law, legislative updates that are relevant to individuals. And we took our pause for June and July for our legislative updates, just recognizing the schedule of our legislators. So we'll be resuming that again in August for our fall courses. On the side of e-learning, I think I covered that in our March meeting. We did release a new e-learning also related to offense gravity score. So I'd encourage members, if you haven't had an opportunity, to check that out. Really happy with how that one turned out. Obviously, I like all of them. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I really like the offense gravity score e-learning. So please check that out if you have an opportunity. And if there are any topical areas that you would like for us to endeavor into, we do have a course schedule for other e-learning throughout the rest of this year, but happy to incorporate that into planning if you think there are any sort of gaps or deficiencies in what we're offering. Some of the highlights of the different outreach activities that we've had, I mentioned earlier, our last meeting, the Allegheny Criminal Law Symposium, Philadelphia Bar Association. Ryan just last week did the Pennsylvania Bar Institute. So those were some notable activities. We regularly are instructing a portion of the Pennsylvania Parole Board's Basic Training Academy, as well as the county probation basic training academies. So we've had several of those sessions, but definitely want to thank the Education Outreach Unit, Jen, Tiffany, Krista in particular, for their efforts in helping with that, and certainly Krista for the development primarily for our e-learning. Included in the materials are our most recent newsletters that we had. First, the quarterly newsletter that summarized the March Commission meeting and other updates. And then last month, we also released our seminar announcement for the next offerings that we have summer and through the end of May through the summer. We'll have another one of those coming out at the end of August to kind of remind people of our fall courses that we have. All right, so I also wanted to just take an opportunity. There we go. To just give you an update, a quick update on the compendium project that we're working on. I covered at our last meeting just a very high level framework of what we're working with for the the commission's compendium. So this, as you may recall, is our replacement to the implementation manual that we've done in the previous edition of sentencing guidelines. We're taking a little bit of a different approach with that. And so what we've done is more like an encyclopedia approach of breaking it out into large topical areas. So as you can see on the screen, we have the different volumes that will encompass the compendium. Right now, we're working through volume 1, which is related to the sentencing guidelines. And within the volumes of the compendium, we have various handbooks. So what I thought today, just to give you a little flavor or more of a flavor, was share just a couple pieces of the handbooks that we have. So far, what we have for you are Handbook 7 and Handbooks 8 related to offense-specific recommendations and then the judicial proceeding considerations. So what I think is helpful is to just kind of lay out a overall visual approach. So for those of you that have looked at our reference materials, our reference guides, there's a very similar flow to how things are organized. I think that's helpful to our practitioners in particular in being able to navigate the document. So what we'll have related to that are at the top, the portion of the guideline or the text that we're referencing. Where relevant, we have historical references. So a big portion of the old implementation manuals was a large historical recitation. We've broken out the relevant portions of that historical context into the different documents. And then also, as we're trying to modernize our deployment of these documents, we have a lot of cross-references. So where you see on screens blue underline, if you're utilizing the virtual version of the document, not that we're really printing a lot of it, but those are clickable to that source material. So thinking through the statutory information that may be helpful, or if there's a citation to another portion of the guidelines, all of that I think is really nice to have at the fingertips of those that are utilizing our compendium. And then any sort of supplemental materials. So looking through, I'm starting with the offense-specific handbook. I won't read each of the pages to you all, but just to kind of give a flavor of that, within each of the handbook, we'll have various parts. And as you can appreciate, topically, each of the handbooks have more or less content that are utilized. So for the offense-specific, we start with something near and dear to my heart is our sentencing matrix. And we talk through how, based on the offense-specific recommendations we're making to the court, how the sentencing matrix is going to be utilized and deployed. We have what the elements are of that. So, we can see on the left is just a screenshot of that. And we'll make these available as we're working through that document. Talking through the part 2, our sentencing levels. What I think is nice is we have, where relevant, are the visual depictions from those documents. So in this example, looking through the different sentencing levels is, I think, a grounding process for individuals to be able to know where they're falling within that and where those recommendations are being made. So at the bottom of the screen, it has the different sentencing levels, what the general recommendations are related to that. And so you can see as you're working through the document how everything is tying together in a really specific aspect of the guidelines, but also in a broader sense, how they also are working in concert with one another. So I think it's a nice approach so far in our early implementation efforts of the compendium. Part 3 relates to those aggravated and mitigated ranges. So you can see again at the top how those would increase or decrease if aggravated or mitigated circumstances are present for that. There's a note in the middle there for something that relates to something that was, I think, important for us to highlight. So I think, as you can see, as you work through the documents, as we work through sharing these drafts with you, I think it's a really tightened approach with the deployment of the information we're trying to convey to our practitioners. So I think, I would welcome any feedback you have for those that are members of the Education and Outreach Committee. As we work through each of these drafts, we will probably start to share more of this information just for that feedback, so that as we deploy it into our our resources for practitioners, we have something that's useful and well organized for individuals. And then the other handbook that I had mentioned is our judicial proceeding consideration. So this is a new section, we talked about historical references. This is an area where there's not going to be a lot of historical references, but I think it's really important for us to have additional context for judges in particular, for areas that they consider at the time of sentencing. So thinking through consecutive and concurrent sentences in particular, we have that laid out. And I think as we would appreciate, are those statutory citations. So there's going to be a heavy utilization of that in this section in particular, to point the courts to that information for the judicial proceeding consideration elements. I think those are my very high level, very quick moving update for you related to the compendium. I don't know if there are any questions. Happy to answer those, but thank you for the opportunity to share that.
Well, thank you, Bobby, and I will turn it over to our executive director to continue with the updates.
Great. So Ryan provided our other partnerships, and just a quick update on our research partnerships. Noah Painter Davis, our other deputy director, and I attended an advisory committee meeting with the Criminal Justice Advisory Committee or group at Penn State University to talk about their ongoing initiatives. But one of the opportunities for some synergy with the university, and something that you'll hear me reference as it relates to the veteran study, is the potential for obtaining behavioral health data. So we spend a lot of time and focus on recidivism as our outcome and not thinking about other measures, things like homelessness or housing, employment status, education, et cetera. So we are partnering with potentially the Social Science Research Institute at Penn State University, who has their footprint in the Commonwealth and a lot of other public health spaces. The challenge is what the identifier, going back to our veteran study, how we would link these data elements. But I think there's a real opportunity. And so part of that, I also want to highlight a ongoing project we have with Allegheny County that's focused on probation. And we have had the opportunity from earlier work in Allegheny to meet their data expert and their data guy. And we're trying to use that as a demonstration project to show that we can look at other outcomes, not excluding recidivism, including recidivism, of course, but looking at additional outcomes by utilizing and leveraging some of their data networks. So we're really excited about that project, and hopefully that will give us an opportunity to learn a lot of lessons about how we might go about getting data from other counties, linking our PCS or AOPC data to these other behavioral health systems. There's a lot of rules and regulations, as you know, in the criminal justice space about PII. There's even more in the medical space around CREA and acronyms that I don't even know what they stand for, but protections for individuals about their personal data. Also want to highlight a couple other activities. One is beyond the staff who are really remarkable in the research and data analysis unit. Part of the way we're able to get a lot of our work done is relying on graduate students and postdocs that we receive through our partnership. And you've heard me say this a lot of times. So our current postdoc is working heavily on the Veterans Project with us. But I just want to give him a little shout out. Nick Goldrosen is got his PhD from Cambridge University, and he recently was awarded the outstanding PhD in the field of criminology, completed by a member of the University of Cambridge. So that was quite an honor. It was the Nigel Walker Prize. He went back to England to receive it. We're really blessed to have Nick on our team and working with our other folks. And through Nick, through our other deputy director, Noah, other staff, we continue to partner with academics. We're working with Jeff Ulmer at Penn State on some research projects. We're working with a new Penn State professor who used to be a postdoc at the commission, Miranda Galvin, on some projects. as well as the former Deputy Director Reese Hester is a professor at Clemson University. So we were really in our free spare time doing some other research that really helps inform the work of the commission. And again, we're really excited about the possibility of expanding the data that we have. Just yesterday, I met with some folks at PCCD about having another summit with them. We've had a previous summit talking about the exchange and leveraging data around the Commonwealth and how we would make that possible. So of course we have, and you'll hear me talk about this shortly, great relationships with the DOC and the Parole Board, with the Pennsylvania State Police, with AOPC, but thinking about other opportunities to exchange and receive data for our vast array of projects that we receive. So, all right, moving on now.
Quick question, actually, Matt.
Yeah.
And the partnerships sound very exciting. With regards to the partnership on the behavioral health data, where and maybe you don't know yet, but where do you know where the data is coming from? Will it be coming from health centers, behavioral health centers? Just like where will that data be getting sourced?
Yeah, and we hope, and I don't know the specific answer yet, that there are repositories at a state level that we're able to link again administratively, some identifier to these big repositories. I think at the county level, like in Allegheny, it'll be the Department of Public Health through them or some other agencies that are collecting that at the county level. Of course, a lot of that information is at the county level, just like everything else, and not necessarily statewide data collection in a uniform manner. But it's something that I think holds great promise, not just for the work of the commission, but for other agencies in the Commonwealth.
So there might be some partnership with like state DOH, depending on what data they have.
So we'll work probably through this Social Science Research Institute at Penn State, I think, who is kind of the broker for that. And they provide, and this is in the weeds, assurances of secure transfer of data and all those protocols and the MOUs that go into it. But I'm not sure the specific agencies, but I will let you know when I'm back in September. We can talk more about what opportunities we've unraveled. Maybe December. We'll see how quick.
That's great. It sounds like an exciting partnership. Thank you.
Okay, now moving on into the research and data analysis unit reporting out. As been talked about this year in 2024, we received data on 8th edition guidelines. So the guidelines became effective on January 1st, 2024 for any offense committed on or after that date. So what this shows is the number of sentences the commission received in 2024 following the validation efforts by month. And the blue represent the 7th edition guidelines and the orange are the contributions of the 8th edition guidelines. If I can find my notes. So just a couple things to note. We had 120,000 roughly sentences, and then we often think in terms of the most serious offense in the JP, so counting it at just the judicial proceeding, 75,000 of those. This is representing all offenses right here is this illustration. But what's important is just to note that in the entire year, calendar year, there's about 20 or 23% of all those sentences were 8th edition. But as we see, as we creep up by month, less than 1% in January, of course, 22.5% by July, a third in October, and roughly half the sentences we're receiving in December are now 8th edition. So as Bobby noted, we're beginning to see more and more of these cases come in. So when we looked at those 25,000 or 17,000 8th edition sentences, we needed to be a little bit careful when we thought about what those sentences are. And one of the things these are most likely less complex cases. So they committed and gotten through the system very fast to receive a sentence. So they're not truly representative of all the cases that we'll see in the 8th edition. So our intent was to share with you lots of information about how the guidelines are working in practice. But our quick look at that showed that these are not actually, it's not a non-random sample. It's not representative. So what we would like to do is to obtain an additional 6 months, which would be through June or July, and in September, come back to you with not 1 year's worth of data, but a composite to get a better picture about the guidelines in practice. So, we spent a lot of time thinking about prior record score 0, how many individuals will be PRS 0, what the assignments will look like in practice, the disposition types, how many people are getting sentenced to state confinement, to county confinement, to probation under the new guidelines. And then the idea we have narrower ranges, how will conformity look like in practice? I also just want to highlight that some of these definitions are a little trickier than we might think about when we're thinking about conformity. And we may need the commission's assistance in either working groups or in September to help us really define some of these edge cases about, did the sentence conform with the guidelines under the 8th edition or not? So my apologies that we're not able to show and showcase a number of these dimensions, but because again, it was a non-random sample, we're not able to showcase how the guidelines are working in practice. We would get a really distorted picture that we don't want to share or showcase at this point because of the fact that it's overrepresented by less complex cases that are moving through the system really fast. So, but as you could see, and we had done a projection, you probably don't remember how quickly we might begin to see these 8th edition sentences, and it's actually below our projections. I don't know what that means in practice, but maybe the cases are more complex and not coming through at the end here. However that is, it's hard to speculate. But so before I move on to talk more about the Veterans Project, any questions or considerations for us as we move forward regarding the 8th edition guidelines?
Any questions?
Okay, great. So apologies for some of the small font sizes on this. Just give you an update on where we are with Senate Resolution 196. I think what's important to note is that our project is due September of 2025. We most recently had our second advisory committee meeting with, that committee is chaired by Representative Bonner, and Representative Krajewski is also a member. And so at that meeting, we provided a lot of high-level overview of a lot of our work and our findings to date. And really, staff right now are turning their attention to writing up all the results. But procedurally, I just want to mention to the commission how this will work. Unfortunately, that September date is prior to our next commission meeting when our report will be due. So what we hope to do is to share with you our executive summary as well as our recommendations. And I'll back up a step. The way we're proceeding with the individual chapters, this will be a very large report. I don't know how many pages, but hundreds of pages possibly. So rather than giving this report to the whole report to individuals, what we're doing right now is targeting the specific chapters of what they focus on. So for example, if it's on Veterans Treatment Court, we've shared a draft of that chapter with a Veterans Treatment Court judge who's on our advisory committee. We have a chapter on, another one on the costs involved in expanding Veterans Treatment Court. One of the judges we met with in Chester County on our site visit is an economist, so he's digging into that chapter. So we will gladly share any chapters with members of the commission. We'd be happy to get feedback on these chapters as we're getting them completed. So I think if we had 9 directives, maybe we're almost done with 5 or 6 of the chapters for dissemination and continuing to work on the others. You'll hear a discussion shortly about our recommendations, but please email me offline if you'd like to receive individual chapters. But I think our plan is to share with the commission, again, the executive summary and the recommendations. And then what we will do at the September commission meeting is to ratify ask the commission and with an action item to ratify the report that was submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee or the full Senate. So I'll just pause for a second and ask Professor Mystic to comment if I stated that procedurally properly. Yeah. Great. And so I don't know if there's any comments or feedbacks on our proposed approach in regards to the report itself. Great. Okay, so just a little bit of background again, and we went through this a lot, is we've made this study is really what we would call in research a mixed methods approach. So we relied on administrative data. We shared with you and talked with you how we've matched that administrative data. We've also done a number of surveys. We've surveyed county wardens, and we also surveyed every president judge. We got an incredible response rate, which informed a number of those specific directives. We also made site visits. We wanted to visit large, medium, and small jurisdictions, something on the west, middle, and east of the state. So we went to Allegheny, Chester, and Jefferson County, where we met with basically every stakeholder involved with any part of the process of working with veterans, from intake to MDJs to Court of Common Pleas judges to the jail to probation, et cetera. And then we did a number of interviews with individual stakeholders in the Commonwealth, veterans justice officers, individuals from the Department of Military and Veteran Affairs. And I'll also just apologize. We made a site visit to SCI Houtsdale. We visited their veteran service unit. We met with the head of that program, Mike Harrington, several times to hear about the way the DOC goes about identifying and then where they're housed and what programs are available at the DOC, et cetera. So at our last meeting, one of the frameworks that we're relying on for our studies is what NOAA presented, Noah Painter Davis, called the Cascade of Care. And that's really the anchor, if you would, of the way we're approaching our analysis as well as our recommendations. So I just wanted to revisit that really quickly and then talk about how this links to our thinking about our recommendations, which I'll cover shortly. So the first phase of the identification or the Cascade of Care is identification of individuals. As we've talked about, there's a challenge right now for identifying veterans in the system. There are questions that can be used to identify or ask them anecdotally, but we also talked about a mechanized approach that may be implemented where the names or some information can be pinged to a central repository and a flag introduced to have that at the front end of the system that says this individual is a veteran. That requires, of course, having a consistent definition of what a veteran is, et cetera. But what the Cascade of Care model suggests is that everybody who is identified as a veteran should be screened. And the screening here is for PTSD, military sexual trauma, et cetera. And these screens are like 5-minute questionnaires. So, and then once we've identified people who have the screen suggest they need a full assessment, which is a reduced subset, we don't know what that is, but maybe it's 50% indicate they have these conditions, a full clinical assessment is made. And then from that assessment, not everybody needs treatment. So there's even a smaller set. So it's a winnowing down of from the starting point to the number that might be referred to treatment. And what we've learned from our site visits and our work is that this Cascade of Care model works basically at all phases. So it would work for the court leading up to sentencing. So prior to sentencing, if you did these assessments, screening individuals through the screening could be assessed just like a PSI for these conditions prior to sentencing, and that information could be available to the judge. It also works, for example, from the Department of Corrections in the way that they do their screening, their assessment, and then what sort of treatment options there are for that individual. Veterans Treatment Court follows a similar path. You're identifying veterans, You're screening them, you're finding good candidates, and then you're finding the appropriate treatment for those individuals. So this has been a real important framework for us, and you'll hear shortly for our recommendations. But one of the things we've been thinking a lot about it, and one of the things we're asked to do is what's the extra burden for courts or for jails or whoever it may be. So I want to go back to our original analysis that we did and presented last time, and just remind you that roughly 5.5% of individuals coming into the criminal justice system at the court are veterans. Okay, so that's somewhat abstract. This looked at 2016 to 2021. So subsequently, we did another analysis that hasn't been shared with the commission. And I just want to walk you through this, what this is. So this is now filings, not it's just looking at lower court filings. And we normalize this to 1 year per court. Okay, so what does that mean? So if we looked at the third class county courts, and those are counties that have population of 210,000 to 499,000. Would include like Berks, Chester, Dauphin, York, etc. So the 5,290 lower court filings are, we took those 6 years worth of data, divide the filings by 6, and there are 11 counties in the third class. So we would divide the total number of filings by 11 counties. So on average, in those third class counties, there are 5,290 lower court filings per year per court. So it's not about an individual court, it's all 11, just average. In those courts, they have the same average of veterans as the statewide average of 5.6. So every filing, it's 5.6. So per year, that's roughly 300 filings that involve a veteran per year. So we wanted to know, if you're thinking about impact, what it is per week. That's 5.7 filings or veterans coming through the door per week, or roughly 1 per day. So when we start thinking about screening and the extra burden, we just said per assessments, the clinical assessments, it's not a ton of them. It might be a half per day. They don't have to be done that day, of course. They can be scheduled out into the. So interestingly, we know this, that the rates of veterans goes up as the county class size gets smaller. So in the 5th through 8, as an example, it's 7.6% of individuals are veterans, but they see roughly 1 veteran a week in those jurisdictions. So we just wanted to get a sense of what the scale of this, well, it's not a problem, but the issue is. And so, yes, in Allegheny and in Philadelphia, there's a lot more veterans coming in, but there's a lot more staff. There's a lot more judges. They have programs in the jail and different types of programs. So I think it's just critical to think through that the extra burden here may be minimal in terms of what the costs are to the courts. One of the questions is what's the delay associated with getting these assessments? Again, we're not talking about every filing that comes in the court. We're talking about 5% of the filings may be receiving, and maybe smaller than that, getting a clinical assessment that could create a little bit of delay, but this is not a huge disruptor for the system. All right, before I go into the recommendations, any questions about this, what this display shows? And okay, great. So just want to share with you some tentative recommendations. We haven't drafted these or crafted these, but clearly we're going to have findings for each of the directives we receive. But I think globally, these will be some of our recommendations. This may actually be too expansive. But starting point is veterans should be identified as early as possible in the process. Where that occurs, is it at arrest? Is it at filing? Is it an intake? Is it by the MDJ? We're not positive how that happens. Is it done through an electronic transmission? We don't know how this will be implemented in practice other than to say there are benefits, and the literature suggests The earlier they can be identified, of course, and then linked to services, the better. We think that veteran status should be incorporated into criminal justice data through a flag. As we talked about in this project, we did that outside of the current data that exists using a federal repository. So that would require coming up with a uniform definition and a mechanized process for confirming status, utilizing and leveraging the Department of Defense's databases that they have. That flag then could follow them through the entire system, so that the OC would have that, so that the jail would have that, the MDJ would be able to see that, the Court of Common Pleas judge would be able to see that, probation would be able to see that flag, we hope. We had some meetings yesterday with the state court administrator and some of the folks at AOPC about this process and how this will be implemented in practice needs to be determined. I'm not sure we have all the answers as the Sentencing Commission of how the court or other agencies should implement this, other than knowing, again, if it could be mechanized, then essentially there is no work. It's just done administratively and the flag is created, and then it leads to that screening possibility. We think that this framework, the cascade of care, should be used to screen and assess veterans prior to sentencing, that it's a nice mechanism to winnow down after identification and utilize most efficiently the clinical assessment resources that exist in the Commonwealth. So the next recommendation has to do with, we think that the veterans treatment courts should be evaluated holistically, meaning that typical evaluations incorporate 3 dimensions: a process evaluation of what they're doing and how the program's implemented, an outcome evaluation, typically recidivism, but we've talked about expanding this to include behavioral health outcomes, and then thinking about a cost benefit, what the benefit to the Commonwealth of having these programs. Of course, lower recidivism, more productive individuals. This particular treatment court has some efficiencies in it, in that the treatment options for a majority of the individuals are done by the VA. Those are provided by the federal government with no cost to the Commonwealth. Individuals in drug court, when they are linking to treatment options, the county typically or insurance pays for those treatment options. But what we know now is there's not a lot of standardization in these programs. There is some effort by the AOPC that was just announced to do a certification process for treatment courts. And I want to say that 2026, and I could be wrong with my facts here, will be drug and mental health court. And the goal is 2027 to do veterans treatment courts. And there are model standards that exist, and people will talk about fidelity to a model, to these empirical based standards. That's what certification would suggest, is that counties, the veteran treatment court, following the best practices, these model standards as given out by a national agency. Again, who would do that type of work? That's a different question. There may be an external agency who could do it with funding, or however that would work. We also think that the efficacy of programs that do exist for veterans should be assessed through an evaluation, one of them being these veteran service units. And anecdotally, the results from individuals in that program are remarkable. So, but doing a structured, rigorous empirical evaluation is warranted for that and other programs for veterans to really identify what works, so that judges and others know that there are effective programs out there. I've talked a lot about the additional outcome measures. And then the final recommendation, this may or may not make it in, but clearly the use of video conferencing seems to be an option in the Commonwealth. And some of that would deal with maybe not the initial screening, but clinical assessments. So counties that don't have trained clinicians, maybe that assessment could be done via video conferencing. Treatment options through video conferencing, just like telehealth and telemedicine now. And we know already, for example, in the regional veterans treatment court, there are participants in that program who are attending their court session through video conferencing. There are only a handful of folks. So when I'm talking about evaluations, hard to know if that's effective when there's 5 or 6 people in the program, not many graduating yet. With that, is it less or more effective than having that individual come before the judge? But I think it gets around some of the access issues, transportation issues, proximity to VAs for a lot of veterans in rural communities, that this is at least a promising avenue to consider. Okay, before I transition away from this study, I'll just say again, staff is really working hard on getting these draft chapters. We're trying to disseminate them to stakeholders for review. We hope to get something in maybe August to you to review related to wording of findings and recommendations, but any questions or comments about the recommendations or our work to date on SR 196? Great. And I just will end by thanking Representative Bonner for agreeing to be on the advisory committee, for providing some feedback that's been invaluable, and to the other members of that advisory committee for taking time through this process. I think it's a great model for us to hear from stakeholders, but it also provided us a great way for us to be able to link up for the people we needed to interview, for surveys, for site visits. It just created a really smooth mechanism for that. Okay. Pivoting now, I'm going to refer you to pages 14 through 20 in your supplemental materials. We've been working, and Brett Miller, our unit manager of the Research and Advisory Committee, referenced our work with the parole board at the last meeting, but we've been working with them on developing some quarterly reports and on their decisions and how the guidelines, the parole guidelines, are working in practice. It's part of our data sharing agreement with the parole board that we would develop these reports for them and share them. So we've been working really closely with the chairman and the board secretary, trying to design something that would be digestible, easy to read, but most importantly, actionable for the board, something that they can review as a management report of how decisions are being made. So we've developed these quarterly reports for the board, and I'm going to show a bunch of pictures, not try to get into the granularity of what the report shows, but just give you a flavor of what we've developed. And what's really great about the reports is they provide a comparison to 3 previous quarters, because absent seeing how things have been previously, how would you know if things have changed? So again, these are really tiny, but what the bars show are the grant rates for violent and nonviolent cases coming before the board. And you could see those bars don't change a lot between the quarters. Grant rate is roughly 40% for violent cases and 55% for nonviolent cases. But this gives a quick way for the board to look and see if they've changed dramatically. Is it the composition of the cases coming before the parole board, et cetera, but what accounts for that? The next set of bars that we share with them are the conformity rates. And this is really of interest to us, is how often is the parole board following the recommendation of the guidelines? And for both violent and nonviolent, it's over 80% conformity rates. Again, fairly consistent across the 4 quarters. All right, definitely don't expect you to look at any of these individual numbers up here, but the reports are shared in the materials. But we provide them individual information of the grant rates by case characteristics, things like age, by gender for violent and nonviolent cases. And then on the right panel, we're sharing with the board about the risk scores themselves and the preparedness factors. So for example, for nonviolent cases, this is the grant rate. For high risk, it's 48%. For medium risk, it's 59%. And for low risk, it's 65%. the way we would expect it to be, that risk is associated with the grant rates by the board compared to a 55% statewide rate. We have information on the individual factors that go into the preparedness index, such as programming and misconducts and so forth. And then finally, what we show here is we're looking at the grant rate for violent and nonviolent cases. This is just for this current quarter by cell. So if you remember, the guidelines themselves are constructed around risk, low, medium, and high. And the other axis is preparedness, low, medium, and high, which creates a 3x3 matrix where recommendations in each cell are to grant or not grant based upon the configuration. So not surprisingly, for nonviolent, as an example, for high risk, low preparedness, so the top left corner, the grant rate is 4%. Low risk, high preparedness, the grant rate is 97%. So again, the recommendations are advisory, so we have some deviation. And then we have another element to the report I haven't shared here, which is the reasons for deviation. Just like the guidelines, why is it that the case went against the recommendation of the guidelines themselves? So we've packed in a lot of information for the board to consider. And then we've also, working with the chairman and the secretary, thought it might be useful to provide reports at the individual level, but only once a year, not quarterly. So how does an individual board member's decision compare to the rest of the board decisions? So we have at the top grant rates and conformity rates. And then we provide these matrices for violent and nonviolent for grant rates by cell that can be compared to the aggregate board members themselves. Well, that's one thing. And then we'll go even smaller font and size is on these individual factors. How does that board member compare? So each bar is the individual board member, and that vertical tick mark would be the aggregate board. And in this example, this board member on almost every dimension grants at a higher rate than the aggregate board. Of course, a different board member may be less or more. And what the purpose again is for that board member to gain individual insights about their decision-making relative to the entire board, to think, why do I do different, or why am I the same? Why am I different for these types of cases or for this type of individual who's before me? So we presented at the parole board retreat this quarter and had great responses to this report. We've just shared with the board our second report at the quarterly level. And again, we think it's a really robust tool. We tried our best to scale this down. It could have been 20 pages, but to keep it as small as possible, but at the same time to provide the level of insight and detail that would allow the chairman and the other board members to really reflect on the way cases are being handled, but also a way that cases might be changing over time to explain variation between quarters. All right, again, my purpose here was not to like go into the granular and explain how the parole board's doing it, but I think this is a really nice way, if you would, to evaluate the way the guidelines are being used in practice. And right now, the conformity rate at 80% is pretty remarkable. Chairman, I don't know if you have additional comments.
Well, if I could just add, at the core of the mission of the parole board is to promote and protect public safety by making fair and equitable decisions. And this gives us so much data that we can now look at. We can look at individuals by ethnicity, race, gender, and see right out whether we're paroling at the same rate for everybody or not. It gives us individually and as a group how we assess preparedness and how we assess risk. And we can measure, are we actually paroling in accordance to the principles that we think scientifically are helpful. And then this individual report does cause not only self-reflection, but also group discussion about how we're making these decisions individually and as a group. So this has been very, very valuable. This is, we couldn't be more pleased. And I don't want to quote Mark Bergstrom at all, but I think we've hit the sweet spot in terms of the compliance rate at 83%. We're doing very well. I think, there are a lot of cases that are on that bubble that shouldn't necessarily follow the guideline. And for those, we have the reasons listed. But I think we couldn't appreciate more the commission's work on this and the staff's work on it, and just the ability to grow and make better decisions.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to partner and work with the parole board. All right, so I'm going to transition now to the next. These ones will go a little bit faster. It's an update on some current/future work of the commission. We have a mandate related to our sentencing risk assessment instrument, which was developed and became effective on July 1st, 2020. And our first mandate was to provide a report regarding the impact of the instrument. So we presented to the commission on 2 or 3 times about how it's being used and so forth. But then the second component there is that we shall revalidate the instrument every 3 years. And let me just make sure everyone understands the idea of revalidate and what this is that tool, if you remember, was constructed using data from 2004, 5, and 6. And we needed that historical data to be able to track recidivism to identify low and high risk individuals. So it was developed with that in mind of distinguishing between individuals who recidivate at a low and high rate. So we've collected data now from 2,000 individuals sentenced in 2015 and 2016. We retrospectively scored them because the tool hadn't gone into effect using the risk assessment tool. So we know their score. So the validation exercise is not to adjust the individual components of the tool, 1 point for this or 2 points for that. It's just to see, does the tool work the way it's designed to work, which is, does it effectively distinguish low, medium, or low, typical, and high risk individuals? And there's a number of statistical ways that we'll measure, is the tool effective in doing that? And we'll share that with you either in September or December, but just letting you know that staff is underway. COVID, of course, delayed really the implementation of this tool. And so we're a little behind the mandate here of the 3-year evaluation, but we're going to, not evaluation, validation of the tool. So we'll present to you at our next meeting. Additionally, staff have begun working on our next short sentence parole evaluation. So we conducted actually 2 reports on short sentence parole. One was originally done, I can't even see the date, a couple of years ago, I guess 2 years ago. And then we did what we call this short sentence parole extension by looking at individuals in county jail with a similar profile. So we've gotten data from the Department of Corrections. And I would say one of the values of this new evaluation is that previously we were only able to look at recidivism rates for 18 months. So after they were released, 18 months because of the newness of the program. So by adding the 2 additional years, we'll now be able to look at 2 and 3 years for some individuals to really see the robustness of that program. And if you remember, the first evaluation showcased the cost savings of the program, but also the very low recidivism rates for participants who were released under short sentence parole. So that also is forthcoming, potentially September or the December meeting, to have that report completed. Okay. The last thing I wanted to, one before the last thing, share with you is just an overview of our 4th data snapshot. As we've mentioned, we've been developing these data snapshots with the idea that we would share them with the commission prior to releasing them on our website. So Just as a reminder, the snapshots previously we've done was possession with intent to deliver for marijuana offenses, an initial evaluation of a short sentence parole program. We showcased the findings of that. And then the last commission meeting, we shared with you this 25-year trend of state confinement sentences. And the idea is it's a very dynamic way that the information is displayed on our website. It's a way for us to showcase evaluations, data trends, information on sentencing practices, but again, in a kind of in a story format. So recently, Ryan and I got a question about the possibility of the commission engaging with enhancements for elder abuse. And through those conversations that we had, we were reminded about the subclassification of fentanyl offenses by the commission several years ago. And so we thought, okay, what if our fourth data snapshot looked at this, what the inspiration for that subcategorization and what's happened with sentencing practices related to fentanyl and possession with intent to. So the inspiration, if you would, or the call for the commission to respond to this, of course, was the opioid crisis here in Pennsylvania. So what this shows is overdose deaths in Pennsylvania over time, and the blue represents those associated with fentanyl. So between 2014 and 2018, we see a shift where over half of the overdose deaths in Pennsylvania were related to fentanyl. So in response to this public health emergency, working with some of the district attorneys and the commission, the idea was to subcategorize the OGS assignments for fentanyl. So prior to the change or the subcategorization, fentanyl was assigned consistent with other narcotics of Schedule 1 and 2 drugs. Those assignments are similar to those for heroin. What we had after that was this subcategorization, individual OGS assignments for weights for fentanyl. And the commission essentially increased the OGS assignment by 3 for every drug weight. So for example, for less than 1 gram, it was previously an OGS of 6 with a standard range recommendation of 3 to 12 months at prior record score 0. It was increased to 9 with a standard range recommendation of 12 to 24 months. So every OGS assignment at those weights was increased by 3. And then because we went to OGS 14 for greater than 100 grams, we combined 100 to 1,000 and greater than 1,000 grams into one category.
Is it?
Senator, yes.
So this is for any possession or possession with intent. And I'm correct that if there is any presence of fentanyl, then the total weight of the substance is used. So if there is a drug substance that has a total weight of say 5 grams, you use the 5 grams weight if there is the presence of any fentanyl detected. That's accurate. That's how this works.
That is correct.
And for under a gram, there's no distinction made around personal use or possession with the intent to deliver. For instance, what I'm getting at, there's no distinction made by those who are perceived to be selling versus those who are perceived to be using. Is that also correct?
This is the assignments for possession with intent to deliver.
So this is only for possession with intent. Okay. All right. Thank you. But can a person be convicted of possession with the intent to deliver when they have less than a gram?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So this figure shows just the number of sentences with possession with intent to deliver for this new subcategorization by year. for this fentanyl. And you could just see over time, and it's in comparison to heroin, that the number of sentences for heroin declined and the number of sentences for fentanyl increased following the adoption of the subcategorization in 2018. This figure now looks at the sentencing alternatives by weight. So what we see here on the first panel on the left is the percent who receive state confinement. The middle is county confinement, and the percent probation. As the weight goes up, then the percentage of individuals sentenced to state confinement increases. But it's notable that only, in the aggregate, roughly half receive a state prison sentence, a quarter receive county confinement, and roughly a quarter receive probation, even though all those standard range recommendations start with a lower limit of the standard range of state confinement. Next, now we're looking at the duration in months based on weight, again, consistent with sentencing practices. As the weight increases, the duration goes up slightly for county confinement. Probation is very stable around that 36 months. That bottom one over 100 grams, there's very few cases there. So I can't remember, a handful. So it's distorting what that average months is. So then we wanted to look also at conformity, and we see that 57% overall of the sentences are within the guidelines. Within the guidelines means mitigated standard range or aggravated sentences. As you increase in weight, that conformity rate declines, or the percent within the guidelines. So the last thing we present is we present the percent within the guidelines and then those outside below and outside above for different types of drugs, just as a comparison. So fentanyl's in the top left. We see 57% are within the guidelines. Cocaine is in the top right. 72% of the sentences are within the guidelines. Bottom left is heroin with 73% within the guidelines. And bottom right is marijuana with about 85% within the guidelines. So we see that for all the drug types, there are sentences that are outside or below the guidelines, and a little bit higher for fentanyl in comparison to cocaine and heroin. So really, we just wanted, based on these conversations, I think it triggered an interest in seeing what happened after that subcategorization in terms of sentencing practices and profiles. So this is, in essence, what the snapshot itself will look like. And then I'll pose two questions. One is if there's any questions about the analysis. And then two, similar to last quarter, we would certainly appreciate any insights about future snapshots from commission members if there's a topic of interest. Tentatively, we are scheduled to share and develop one related to the Veterans Project. And it would be based on our administrative data that we presented to the commission 2 times ago, but we wanted to wait until after the report was submitted to the Senate before we published anything about our results. We have a couple other, I'll call it in the hopper, like scheduled in the future. But if there's an issue or a topic, we certainly would love to develop one in response to commission members' interest rather than what we think would be of interest to stakeholders and the commission. But I think it's a really great vehicle, as we've shown, to present and showcase results from evaluations, trends over time, or really a deep dive into an individual case type about sentencing practices in the Commonwealth. So before I go to my last slide, and I've been talking a lot, I'll see if there's any questions.
One a question of maybe just like future data that I'd be interested in seeing compared with this data snapshot would be any tracking of recidivism rates based off of where they landed on the deviation from the guidelines, and then any trends around fentanyl related offenses generally. I'm just curious about how the new guideline and the deviations compare with recidivism and rates generally.
Great, thanks. And I'll just, the studies of recidivism are a lot more complex for us because we have to get data from the state police, rap sheets, and all kinds. So it's a pretty heavy lift to do that, but we would gladly do it at the same time if that's of interest, and
Thank
we
you.
could talk more about it.
That'd be great. Any other questions? Okay, seeing none.
All right, my last item in this research and data analysis section is just to note that we continue to receive requests for our data, to use our data for legislative impacts. And we had 2 requests from attorneys, one private and one from a DA, related to providing an analysis that our staff is happy to provide to our stakeholders. So with that, excuse me, I will turn it over now to Craig Briggs, who's our senior developer, for an update on the application information technology.
Thank you, Executive Director, and good afternoon, everyone. In Christie's absence, I'll be giving the update. So we have the on staffing. Matt mentioned we have a departing developer. Oh, sorry. Let me get this closer. Hopefully that's better. So as Matt mentioned, on staffing, we had a departing developer. That developer was primarily responsible for maintaining the legacy SGS application. With that departure, Sean and myself have been stepping in to fill those tasks and maintain that application as needed. With the approval of the service purchase contract, we'll be adding a full stack developer from Carbon Creek to fill in on the Caser project as Sean and I spend more time maintaining the legacy project so that that Caser project can remain on schedule. And speaking of the schedule, the roadmap here, we are on track as this predicts. We did just finish the sentencing guidelines generation portion of the Caser application. We are now focused on building the sentence submission portion of the application. We have a couple of highlights here from the development. We simplified the manual entry of prior record score data, redesigned the case history page for better usability. We improved our CPCMS integration, added a new logging situation surrounding our JNet communications, and had a lot of overall usability improvements, bug fixes, and things like that. We've also collaborated with members of the education and outreach team to begin user acceptance testing. So they have been in the sentencing guidelines generation process. They've seen the screens and are providing feedback. We replicated several real world cases from the production application and saw how they worked in the new application to compare the results and just make sure everything came out correctly. Any issues we discovered during testing have been logged, and we will be incorporating the feedback on the usability as we continue. For the project timeline, we're currently developing sentencing submission guideline features, as I mentioned, and we are in the process of user acceptance testing as we continue. That will be ongoing through the remainder of the project so that we are constantly getting that feedback. And as Bobby mentioned earlier, I believe the Education Outreach Unit has started planning the development of the user training materials for formal training so that the end users will have that when they gain access. On the screen here is a snapshot of our new guideline form format. We, as one of the most critical outputs of the application, generate the guideline form to provide to the courts as they're sentencing. As part of the Caser project, it has a new look and feel. We've basically redesigned it from the ground up to hopefully be more straightforward and provide the information more readily. And since several members of the commission use this form regularly, Christie will be reaching out to solicit feedback and have some discussions about the new format to make sure that we really get it right before the Caser project goes fully live. So please keep an eye out for her invitation. I think she'll send those out late June.
It's good because we hate the current formats. So
Understandable. And then just a couple of updates quickly on what else we've been working on. So the legacy SGS web, we did have a few minor issues that we addressed in February related to DUI statutory limits, that we're missing the fine recommendation on the guideline form. And we've also prepared a data set for the risk instrument validation that Matt mentioned. And I just want to mention for SGS web usage, as of April 30th, over 32,000 sentences have been submitted for 2025. And details are available in the supplemental information under sentences by county and year report. That's a little bit outdated. Like I said, it's April, but I'm sure it's higher by now. And so in summary, CASER progress is ongoing and on track, and SGS Web continues to be maintained as needed. I'm happy to take any questions. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and our last, before our miscellaneous category is a policy update from our Senior Deputy Director.
Thank you, Matt. And I recognize where we are in today's meeting at 1 o'clock. I'm also been told that there's lunch in the hallway, and here I am yet again keeping you from that. So I think I have my directions. We're going to get through this information in a brief manner. However brief I talk about it doesn't diminish the importance of the information that I'll be providing you. At the top of the screen, you see case law tracking. Each quarter you hear me discuss that we track case law. Sometimes there's not a lot to talk about. You will find a case law tracking sheet in your supplemental notebook at page 27. What I will say is we complete the materials for these meetings multiple weeks in advance of the meeting. And after completing the case law tracking document, 2 significant cases, I think, at least in terms of sentencing and resentencing guidelines were published, 2 opinions, Shiflett and Slaughter. So they are not included in your notebook materials, but I just at least wanted to raise them. I know I had some side conversations prior to the meeting with some of the members that are well aware of these, and I don't think it's necessary for me to go into detail of those cases. But I would just say that in terms of guideline related and resentencing guideline specific, if you have not had the opportunity yet to read the Slaughter case, that was a case in which the court resentenced an individual following a revocation of probation, however, did not have the resentencing guidelines at the time of the revocation, so therefore did not consider the guidelines. And much like previous court decisions where our appellate courts have said to sentencing courts, you must consider the sentencing guidelines, the Slaughter case is telling courts that you must consider the resentencing guidelines. So from a staff perspective, we appreciate the opinion because we've been telling lots of practitioners that for almost 2.5 years or more that you need to consider those. And now the appellate court said, yeah, you should consider those. And then the Shiflett case talks about consideration of ARD as a prior offense for DUIs. I think I'll leave it at that. I think we all know where the case stands now. And I just wanted to raise those 2 cases to members in case they had not been made aware of them. In terms of legislative tracking, standard fare for us, keeping tabs on what the General Assembly has going on. In supplemental notebook, page 28, you'll see a long listing of bills that are out there pending. As things pass, we will certainly make the commission aware of that information during quarterly meetings. But I don't think at this point there's much for me to say, but you can see in the materials that we continue to build out the tracking. The next item on the list, as you see, is the errata discussion. What I want to at least point to you is in page 44 through 49 in the notebook is the material that I'll be referencing. This slide is what I will talk about briefly here. I will be asking for an action item for a motion for the commission's consideration in a moment, but let me just start with reminding the commission that in our 2 previous meetings in December and March, I talked in much detail about errata, the purpose of it, and why we have it. We have found since the adoption and the publication of the 8th edition, just typographical errors. And so we're trying to stay on top of those. We anticipated that. So in the past, I've provided you with updates of an errata document. Again, in the notebook, page 44 through 49 is said document. What I wanted to ask for the commission is just out of an abundance of caution from a staff perspective, we make this information available on the commission's website. That's consistent with past practice. We can go back to the 7th edition and all of its amendments, and we had errata documentation available on the commission's website. But as I mentioned, just out of caution from a staff perspective, I would be asking for a motion to approval of the errata for the 8th edition sentencing guidelines for the purpose of posting on the commission's website. So again, it's in page 44 through 49 in the notebook. It's what I had previously presented to you in December of 24 and March of 25.
I so move.
Do I have a second for the motion? Seconded by Dave Bible. All those in favor? All opposed? Motion passes.
All right, wonderful. The final slides that I have for us to review, and they're not asking for any action from the commission here. And this is sort of consistent with us tracking legislation and bringing matters to the commission for their consideration. There's two parts here, and I'll try to be concise in the description of it. One is Act 18 of 2024. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then through the 8th edition guidelines is the commission's omnibus sentencing enhancement policy. And so you can find the information that I'm referencing in your notebook, page 50 through 64. In particular, page 50 through 55 is Act 18. And I will summarize this at a very high level. There's a number of things involved with the act, but for our purposes for today, and at least raising for the commission's consideration in terms of the omnibus enhancement policy, is what did Act 18 do for what we think about in terms of sentencing and the guidelines? First, the act created a new offense. It sort of expanded in previous offenses where you were no longer to be texting while driving. Now you're not to be using, in effect, your phone while you're driving, right? So that's what you see here, the 3316.1, prohibiting use of an interactive mobile device. So that's a new Title 75 vehicle code offense. The act also amended Section 3732 and 3732.1, which is homicide or aggravated assault by vehicle offenses. And when it amended that, it particularly amended of those sections, the area which it included language around a sentencing enhancement or requiring the commission to have sentencing enhancements. So I just want to frame that up to say that's where we are with the act. And as of last week, it's become effective. And so we're, from a staff perspective, looking to the commission to just maybe provide us some guidance. And again, you can have time after today's meeting to cogitate on this, but I wanted to at least raise it for the members, because this is the first instance under the new guidelines in which we have to look to the omnibus enhancement policy. And I guess it gives us something to think about, right? But what I wanted to at least talk about on this slide is, this is just some summary information of the commission's omnibus enhancement policy. I provided you an excerpt of the text in the notebook, which you'll find on page 56 and 62. And what the intent of the omnibus enhancement policy was to do, or is to do, is to fill that gap in which the General Assembly creates an enhancement, or requires the commission rather to adopt an enhancement, and the commission then would have to amend the guidelines. So consistent with how we have an omnibus OGS policy, where if the General Assembly creates a new offense, we have a placeholder for an OGS for that offense up until the commission decides to amend or revise the guidelines. It's the same idea with this policy. It's to be that placeholder. And the general rule of thumb for the omnibus enhancement policy is, if there is not an enhancement, then the omnibus policy applies, and you would increase whatever that offense gravity score is by 1, right? That's sort of the basis and the basics of the enhancement policy. However, in the enhancement policy for the omnibus, it also states when the commission doesn't have an enhancement, right? That's sort of the other way to look at it, when either the commission has one or doesn't have one. And so the question from me to the commission members in this instance is, do we already have an enhancement for homicide and aggravated assault by vehicle, or is this totally new? And, so the base level, any takeaway is that there will be an increase in the offense gravity score for these offenses. The question is, for this first time out of the gate, how do we interpret the enhancement policy And most importantly for staff, how do we educate practitioners on the implementation of that? And also how do we make sure that we program our online application to reflect it? So let me go back one slide and I'll stop and open it for any questions. But again, I'm not necessarily asking commission members to opine on this right now. Just want to raise it and we can follow up later. The commission currently, and has now for many years, had a requirement to enhance homicide by vehicle or aggravated assault by vehicle when certain factors occurred. And in particular, those factors have been, did it occur in a work zone? Right? I'm going to give you some of them, not all of them. Was the person also convicted of a DUI? Or were they texting at the time that they committed the offense? Right? And I think for most of us, we're familiar with those laundry list of factors that would trigger the enhancement for homicide or aggravated assault by vehicle. Act 18, with the creation of the new offense of prohibiting use of an interactive mobile device, then slotted that offense into that sentencing enhancement language. So you have this listing of all of those other vehicle code violations or, behavioral type things. And now you have included 3316.1. So I just raised that to say, what should we sort of be instructing individuals on? Does the commission view it as we currently have enhancements for homicide and aggravated assault by vehicle, and this is now just a new factor for it? Or is this completely new, right? Does that make sense? I don't know. In my head, it seems like it does, but when it comes out, I'm not always sure.
I clarified it for me. That was the question I was going to ask, but your answer just answered my question. Any other questions? Seeing none. All right.
Okay, so the final item is just to announce the September meeting, which will be on September 11th. I will be working with the chair and the vice chair and just determining what the appropriate schedule, as Ryan mentioned. There might be more policy work at this one that requires a different structure than this new one from 11 to 116. And I think this is a meeting we're trying, now under the new model to encourage everybody to attend in person if possible. And we'll schedule some events and different things in State College. So more to come on that. And then just a reminder that in the coming weeks, I'll be reaching out to the appointing authorities regarding the reappointment of commission members with the terms ending September 30th of this year. So with that, any other questions, but I'll turn it to the chair for a motion to adjourn.
Seeing no other questions, do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll also move.
All right. Moved by Attorney Balkovic. Is there a second?
Second.
All right. We have a couple seconds. All right. All those in favor? All opposed? All right, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.